Well, good morning. My name is Stefaan. I'm just the chair of the next session, even though I feel that we had already so many issues put on the table that we could go on with the first session. So I think it's nevertheless time to go to the next session. I'm on the program as an affiliate fellow of the Collegio Carlo Alberto, but I am also a commission official, so I work for the European Commission. I'm actually also an alumnus of this place. Michael Keating was in my jury, and it's nice to see some old faces here and to reconnect with some people also who were in the convention, actually, where we drafted Article 50. So the ambassador, Paolo Ponzano, is now a retired commission official who's here at the EUI. We all were involved in that process back then. Since yesterday, I work with the Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator in the European Commission. And so I maybe at the end of this session say a couple minutes, a few words on what we have done so far. And, but within that task force of the Commission, I myself am in charge of reaching out to think tanks, also to experts. So I'm very happy for the Schuman Center and for Bridget and Anand to have invited me here. It will be also my job as we go along in these uncharted waters to pick up ideas that are developed the outside of the institutions, in universities, in think tanks, in the worlds of stakeholders and other actors. So I'm very much looking forward to listen to this debate. Let me start by calling on the speakers. So we have a session on politics, economics, and the legal aspects, as I would summarize the three speakers. And first, I call on Simon Bulmer on the organisation of UK central government. Simon.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to think about some issues, namely how European policy is coordinated, that I've worked on in the past, and how this is going to relate to the issue of Brexit. So I'm going to focus pretty much on the process, following on from some comments that Anand has already made. This is the start of the process, so it's difficult to reach any conclusions. It is a story of complexity, and occasionally I make some references to another of my interests, which is music. If I can work out how to move the slide on. How do we move this on?
Yeah.
This way?
No?
No. Right.
Has it gone to sleep?
I'm not sure you're in slideshow mode yet.
Oh, are you not in slideshow mode?
It's all right, Mouse.
I'm the last person to ask
Anybody
about these things.
Oh, all right, okay. So the panel is called Brexit Means Brexit. What does that mean? Well, I just thought I'd try and answer that question a little bit at the outset. And I think there are three particular uses of Brexit. There is the referendum itself, the decision back in June. Secondly, the meaning of Brexit that I'm going to use in this session, which is about the process of change, the process by which the UK leaves the European Union, including the negotiation of Article 50. And then there is the actual exit. I've talked here of Heinz 57 varieties. We can talk about soft or hard Brexit, Norwegian, Swiss models, and all that sort of thing. I'm not going to speak about the policy content, I'm really speaking about the process. And as was said earlier, there are, if you take a Eurosceptic position, perhaps 3 steps to heaven. The exit process through Article 50, the negotiating the new relationship with the EU, but then I think also a transitional phase, and alongside that the domestic process of the Great Reform Bill to continue with that EU legislation that is thought desirable to retain. Well, reach of this issue of Brexit is going to affect the whole of government, well beyond the Department for Exiting the European Union and the Department for International Trade and Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So it's got wide impact across Whitehall, reflecting what I worked on with Martin Birch a couple of decades ago on the impact of Europeanisation, including on policy making, administration and legal functions that doubtless Derrick will talk about. It impacts also on the agencies of government out into wider circles. And one of the paradoxes of this process is that given civil service cuts and so on, there's going to be a need to increase the European capacity of UK government to actually leave due to the scale of challenge, not just with trade negotiators. So this is rather an odd consequence. And of course it has got ramifications for devolved. I'll say something about that later without trying to intrude on the afternoon session, but the reserve of the UK government over European policy holds together the devolved authorities' responsibilities for policies like environment and so on. So the glue of the UK constitution is involved as well. Okay, well, just a quick look back at how coordination and organisation took place in the past, when it was perceived perhaps as a Rolls-Royce machinery. It was a light touch coordination approach with strategic direction from the hub, that's the Cabinet Office, primarily the European Secretariat in its various forms, with the Foreign Office, UCREP and intermittent interventions from the Prime Minister. They form the hub. And then there is a second tier, an inner core of ministries, the Treasury, DEFRA, Food, Rural Affairs, and as it's now called, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the former DTI, Business Innovation and Skills and so on. And then there's the outer core, to which I guess the new Department for International Trade has to be added. And there were a range of coordinating arenas from the Cabinet Office down to EU coordinators coming together in the under the auspices of the Cabinet Office from line ministries. If we move to the situation now, we've got quite a different setup with a number of risks, I think, involved. Some of these were spelt out in a review by the Institute of Government before the actual ministerial responsibilities were divided up. In that review, a department for exiting the EU was seen as having serious operational drawbacks. It had the advantage in this study by Rutter and McRae of offering a long-term home for the task of leaving the European Union, especially if trade was included, which of course it wasn't, and offering a clear sense of leadership for the task, as opposed to ministers perhaps having two hats, one for the Treasury and one for exiting at the same time, or a junior minister in the Cabinet Office. But there are a number of disadvantages which were set out, and it's worth just mentioning some of these. The delay in getting it off the ground, which presumably Anna's reference to photocopies might be included in that. The need to coordinate policy in a different way to the rest of government business, against the normal coordinating logic of Whitehall. The need to develop a good working relationship with UCREP, which has been used to negotiating the day-to-day policy with the EU, but has also got to negotiate an exit from the EU. How to liaise with the Cabinet Office, then the possible dynamics that can result from this, that House positions develop with individual ministries having their own interests, their own responsibilities that they want to defend against this ministry. This would be a very new situation in UK government, and at the same time, where does the Prime Minister fit in? Does the Prime Minister trust everything to David Davis and his department, or does the Prime Minister have to create some kind of shadowing activity to keep an eye on what he's doing? So Theresa May is in charge, and there's a Cabinet European Union Exit and Trade Committee with a rough balance of Leave and Remain on it. Looked like more leavers to me. Pressure on civil servants, numbers, I've mentioned, the lack of trade negotiators. Now, the Department for Exit in the EU has already been set up. Its responsibilities are set up there. I hope they're legible: to support the negotiation to leave, working with devolved administrations, Parliament, wide range of other interested parties, supporting the Prime Minister in negotiating, supporting bilateral discussions on exit with other countries, and coordinating across government work to seize opportunities. This is a big set of tasks here that DEXEU has got. It's already got its upper echelons in place, and with a staff of 200. So it's bringing together staff from the Cabinet Office, European Union, from the European Director of the FCO, and from UCREP. And it's taking over this coordinating responsibility previously in the Cabinet Office. What happens to DEXEU at the end of this, at the end of Article 50, remains to be seen. And I suppose the staffing issues there are, do people see this as an opportunity to further their careers, or do they not want to go there because it's a very short-term department? Well, coordination and the players is obviously going to be an important dimension. The politics that Anand and others have referred to is key here. Key figures: Theresa May, David Davis, Dr. Liam Fox in the Trade Department, Boris Johnson, of course, who helpfully was at Wednesday night at an awards ceremony, said that it was going to be a titanic success, the Brexit negotiations. Not quite sure what that means. Philip Hammond in the Treasury, who's presumably going to reflect business interests, along with Greg Clark, Andrea Leadsom in DEFRA. So a real representation of leavers in there, and a mix of departmental interests to defend. Theresa May doesn't want to have a running commentary. I guess this is part of her position for not wanting the parliamentary debate and trying to stop people going off-piste in ministerial interventions that did not exist, of course, during the Conservative Party conference, where she herself emphasised control over migration and over the Court of Justice. And as we've heard from other speakers, so I'm not going to refer to that in detail, there's the Conservative Party politics and the Labour Party's own problems. Then there's parliamentary accountability. We've heard about that before. The large pro-Remain majority, but a large pro-Leave majority of opinion in the constituencies. The whole question of how Parliament will be able to monitor negotiations was raised by yesterday's ruling. There is a shadow committee, shadowing committee, the Exit in the EU Select Committee, chaired by Hilary Benn, that's been set up, but it hasn't got underway yet with its work. There's a lot of work to be done here, as Anna was saying, also with the Great Reform Bill, but taking back control surely entails giving Parliament a clear role. There is the question, and John spoke about that, of the circumstances under which a general election could be called, and we can talk about that further if we wish. What about wider consultation? Because this is clearly going to happen. It's part of what DEXU says it's going to do, and so far this consultation involving the minister seems to be solely involved in engaging business leaders. And we've not mentioned this before, but of course business has been traditional source of support, financial and otherwise, for the Conservative Party. So how will this play out? Will there be a consensus arrived via that route, or will business and government come to divergent views with all that that might imply? Beyond the business community, of course, there's the public, and also the issue that we've alluded to, which is framing and how the media plays the whole issue, which in a sense, well, we've got a sense of with this judgment yesterday and the screensaver we've had before. This may not be very easy to read. It's a map from the Institute of Government of all the players involved. So sort of going around the map, there's the Whitehall Department. So I'm going to go anti-clockwise. The Whitehall Department, Scotland, English local councils. One of the issues is, what is the voice of England here? We've got the Greater London Authority and the London Mayor, but no level of governance before 418 local councils. Wales, Northern Ireland. Other countries, we shouldn't forget the Gibraltar issue, which is also a possible road bump in the negotiations. Commonwealth World Trade Organization that Britain has to join, the UN and NATO, and then the EU negotiation. So this is a complex set of partners in the negotiations. Now, I just want to say something very briefly about the devolveds. Theresa May has said government will not trigger till a UK-wide approach has been agreed. So this is separate from the parliamentary dimension. UK-wide approach agreed most likely through JMCEN. This is a new committee of the devolved authorities and the UK government that was only established in the last couple of weeks and is not meeting till sometime this month. Because of the different votes that we'll hear about later, the different authorities want to have a strong voice in negotiations, and there is a bit of an English problem. Where is England's voice beyond the London Mayor and the GLA, bearing in mind Annan's concern, or the lady's concern that you're talking Newcastle about is different here from in London, and of course there may be an intervention from the Irish government. Each of the devolves is putting in place its organisational arrangements, like Mike Russell as Minister, note the language for UK negotiations on Scotland's place in Europe, with an advisory board, things coordinated in a more typical British manner through a cabinet secretariat, and its own para-diplomacy and discussion of establishing trade offices beyond the UK function. So, sort of bringing this all together into the challenges for the UK state, the differentiated vote is important to have in mind. The asymmetrical nature of devolution, the English problem of London centrism for the largest entity in the EU and where most of the votes came from, I think I'm right, in the Leave vote. There's the Northern Ireland issue we'll discuss later, so how to find this UK-wide approach. Is there potential here for a constitutional crisis? I think we've heard that being referred to already, and the Gibraltar issue that I've just mentioned. I was reminded of this song by Neil Sedaka, Breaking Up is Hard to Do, and I think that is probably the case. Let me just say something though, about how we should perhaps look at this from an analytical perspective, because this is a bit of a troubling situation for me, as I suppose a historical institutionalist, and historical institutionalism seen as better explaining incrementalism and path dependency and all these kinds of things. So how can I possibly carry that argument over? Well, I don't know, I haven't had to start yet, and we're at an early stage. I suppose if you want to go down a rationalist approach, we've got probably three-level game in play here of the domestic, the devolved, the UK, and the EU level negotiations, and that in itself is an indication of the complexity of things. The challenge for historical institutionalism is the importance of agency here. Historical institutionalism is traditionally criticized for emphasizing structure too much, so the structure agency issue is very much in play. British political agency in relation to the negotiating position, and then UK government agency in relation to EU structures when it gets to the negotiations properly. There's been an interesting development, at least in the UK, I think, in linking some of the work that Jim Bulpett did, one of Willie's former and late colleagues, on statecraft as a way of managing what is effectively political agency, and whether this can introduce a stronger agency input into historical institutions. We did some work on neo-statecraft theory, and I think that's probably where I would be looking at that as far as the analytical perspective is concerned.
Thank you, Simon. We spoke about during the break. Our idea was to try to finish 12:30 with the speaker, so we have half an hour before lunch for a discussion. We spoke about fruit picking before the break, and from talking to Derrick, I think we're going to speak about cherry picking a little bit now, so that's a more specific fruit we're turning to. Derrick.
I'll have to retrieve my microphone first.
My children would love that. When I appeared before the House of Lords Committee in March, EU Committee, the first thing I did was knock my water over when I sat down. And what persuaded my two very grown-up children to watch a bit of that was hoping to catch me doing it, but the tactful camera missed me out. I'm a lawyer. My career has been as an academic and as a practitioner. I've advised governments and businesses. I've argued more than 100 cases before the EU courts. In the majority of cases, my client was the UK government. So my approach, I think, is fed both by theoretical considerations and by practical considerations. What can this lawyer add to this debate? Well, that was a hard question. And I thought I'd, in a sense, take as a starting point the word cherry picking, or the words cherry picking. Cherry picking has become part of the political discourse. And I shall try and ask and answer, from a legal point of view, a straightforward question. Is there a hard and fast distinction between market access rights for EU members and market access rights for operators from third countries? My response to that is, well, no. The distinctions are fluid, and over time, market access rights for EU members and their companies have come to overlap with market access rights for third countries and third country business operators. let's briefly look at some EU internal market rights and compare them. And I promise this won't be in great technical detail. Let's compare them, the EU internal market rights, with some examples from CETA, the Canadian agreement, and also the way some of the internal EU market regimes work, which admit third country operators. First, free movement of goods. This is obviously fundamental element of the internal market. There is free trade for all goods within a customs union. In the Canada agreement and in the EEA agreement, now the EEA agreement is often said to provide access to the internal market, and I won't argue about that description for the sake of it. But in both the Canada agreement and the EEA agreement, there is free movement for originating products. In the Turkey agreement, there is free movement for industrial products within a customs union. The free movement of goods, which applies in the Norway agreement, the EEA agreement, is replicated in dozens of agreements between the EU and third countries. Do they all provide free movement of persons? No. Do they all make contributions to the EU budget? To ask the question is to answer it clearly not. The free movement of goods within the internal market is not in any way intrinsically something for EU members, and it is traded regularly with third countries. Services. The freedom to provide services in the EU, and it's a very comprehensive guarantee, and I don't want to understate it in any way. What do we see in the Canada agreement? Actually, quite a lot. The starting point in the Canada agreement is that there is non-discriminatory access for service providers each way, for them all, unless excluded. This is an interesting way of doing it. It's a kind of upside-down way of doing the way the thing has been done in many cases in the past. And there's no doubt there are loads of exceptions, and a lot of them were exceptions that Canada wanted to see, and a lot of them were exceptions that the EU wanted to see. But it would be wrong to deny that there is an extremely comprehensive guarantee of non-discriminatory access for service providers in this agreement. There is no provision for the passporting of Canadian EU financial services providers. Now, there is non-discriminatory access for providers, but there isn't a passporting arrangement. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a context other than the Canada agreement. Let's look at capital. In the EU, there is free movement of capital. And what that means is free movement both for direct and portfolio investment. Direct investment is where you can invest to acquire control of a business. Portfolio investment is essentially where you invest for a return. That distinction isn't drawn in the Canada agreement. So you shouldn't expect, when you compare the EU regime and look at a deal like the Canada deal, you shouldn't expect to find the same words. But the effect is to cover both direct and portfolio investment. And there are some exceptions. And Canada in particular wanted to make some exceptions. It wanted to make an exception for being able to exercise a right of veto over certain foreign takeovers of companies. The UK, I just remarked, the UK Prime Minister, a short while ago, indicated that this was one area where the UK might want more control. about excluding certain foreign takeovers. Now, this is something which is more difficult to do within the framework of the EU than from outside it. Within a deal like the Canada Agreement, there will be much more flexibility. I don't want to say, incidentally, I'm not arguing for a kind of agreement that the UK should be looking for. I'm addressing this question as to whether there's some kind of intrinsic menu, limited menu, that can be available for third countries negotiating with the EU. Coming back to the capital investment, there is extensive free movement of capital. There isn't the same degree of free movement of payments, but there is a mutual commitment in the Canada Agreement to move as far as possible on free movement of payments. And let's not get into the distinction, but it would be wrong to deny that the Canada Agreement was anything other than a very ambitious regime for mutual investment. Between the EU on the one hand and Canada on the other. Professional qualifications, something that is very important in the context of free movement of persons. How does it work in the EU? It works in a number of ways. There's remarkably little harmonization of professional qualifications in the EU. There's a short list of harmonized professions: doctors, nurses, pharmacists, architects. If you read the harmonizing legislation, it's quite interesting, because it's clearly based on the prior judgment that these professions are largely comparable, that the qualifications are largely comparable. If you look at the definitions of what a doctor, the knowledge a doctor has to have in all the EU member states, which justifies mutual recognition, the degree of generality is substantial. For the great majority of so-called mutual recognition, one starts with a presumption of equivalence. But then, and I'm talking about the consolidated 2005 directive on qualifications here, but then you have elaborate mechanisms for adaptation periods and testing to actually confine mutual recognition to equivalence. So I'm not criticizing that, but it's the way it is. In most cases within the EU, the mutual recognition of qualifications is based on actual measurement of equivalence. If we switch into the Canada Agreement, what you have, mutual recognition of qualifications that's based on recognition of equivalence. Now, there's one way that there's one profession singled out for sweetheart treatment in EU law, and I'm not knocking it, it's lawyers. Lawyers in the EU are entitled to practice under home country title in other EU countries. This even extends to litigation, and one of the most enjoyable forensic experiences of my life was arguing a case in the forecourts in Dublin representing 2,000 Irish dairy farmers, using, as it were, my lawyer's passport, the fact that I could practice as a barrister in Ireland. And so I did, and we ultimately won our case before the European Court, because there was a reference from the Irish courts to the European Court. Now, that doesn't exist in the EU-Canada agreement. And because of that, lawyers in the UK are very dismissive of the arrangements in the Canada agreement. But a lot of the arrangements are very similar to the arrangements in EU law. Financial services. This in particular is of interest to the UK, the passporting of financial services. If one had to single out a particular one that the UK would like to negotiate for, maybe it would be wholesale banking services. And this is where those on the EU side of things tut and talk about cherry picking. And I would say, okay, let's just hang on. Let's look at some of the internal market regimes that apply equivalency to third country operators. Now, for short, I'll refer to the MiFID regime and the AIFMD regimes, the latter being the Alternative Investment Fund Management Directive regime dealing with hedge funds. Both these regimes offer passporting directly from operators outside the EU into the EU in the same way as you get passporting inside the EU on the basis of equivalence of regulation, capitalization, what have you. What does that suggest? Well, it only suggests that almost nothing within the EU acquis has been regarded to date as being off limits for international negotiations. Obviously, the EU can refuse to deal on anything it wants to with the UK. If we're not careful, we will mutually self-destruct in the process that's coming up. I hope we don't. My own hope is that we will find a mutually acceptable economic and political accommodation. A final words on the ECJ and on financial contributions. It would be very difficult to accept the ECJ as an adjudicator in terms of differences between the UK and the EU on the interpretation of any trade agreement. But that's true of most trade agreements. Even the EEA agreement between the EFTA countries, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein on the one hand, and all the EU members on the other. The European Court ruled out the mechanism that had been agreed between the member states. And as a result of that, you have the EFTA states run their own enforcement mechanism. I'm not offering the EEA arrangement as a model. I'm not offering models. That's not really my role. But I would point out that there is no essential role for the Court of Justice in moderating, in adjudicating disputes between the parties. Obviously, internally within the EU, the Court of Justice will operate. How the rules would be applied internally of a trade agreement by the UK would be a matter for negotiation. And there are various models knocking around. In the Canada agreement, there are arrangements for arbitration and adjudication, which are not the ECJ. And finally, a word on financial contributions. I don't rule out an arrangement with the EU where there are some financial contributions made by the UK. It's not for me to rule it in or rule it out, and that's why I've said so little about pointing in directions the UK-EU might go, because obviously I don't know. And if I were to express my preferences, they would be irrelevant. The three EFTA members, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, make no contribution to the EU budget. They make direct contributions to agreed projects. That could be a crucial distinction, incidentally, for the UK. If, and I say hypothetically, because this is the only example we have of contributions being made to EU projects outside of EU membership, what is the level? Well, if you gross up, I haven't done this. I was reading an article that claimed to have done it. But if the UK contributed under a hypothetical trade agreement with the EU to EU projects at the same level at which Norway contributes to EU projects under the EEA, the UK would be making net contributions of low billions rather than the 10 billion net contribution that it makes at the moment. That 10 billion is a relatively recent figure. I haven't tried to work out whether it's affected by the collapse of the pound. So financial contributions, the only example we have, they're not to the budget, they're to projects, and in the only example we have, they are GDP by GDP comparison at much lower levels than EU membership. Nevertheless, the package that those countries get is generally build a single market membership. I think that's probably all I have to say, deliberately, again, refraining from venturing potential options. And the fact that I've referred to the Canada agreement, the fact I've referred to the EEA agreement, the fact I've referred to these internal market regimes which provide access to third country operators, I'm referring to them as examples of what happens, not as a model for where the UK and the EU might go. Thank you.
Thank you, Derrick, for this very good and comprehensive overview of the issue of the single market and the freedoms. I myself worked in DG Financial Services till last Monday, so I was happy to hear some acronyms like MiFID and AIFMD, and I'm sure we all will become familiar with a lot more of these acronyms, because I think in the financial services there are like 20, 25 different pieces of legislation that are out there. So thank you for that very comprehensive overview. We move to the last presentation by Jonathan Portes on the economics of Brexit. So Jonathan.
Thanks. Well, if we're going to move on to questions by 12:30, I'm going to have to cover the topic of the economics of Brexit in 7 minutes. So I will try to be relatively crisp. In particular, I won't try and cover the sort of medium to longer term options for the future relationship, which I think Derrick sort of sketched the legal background to. We can talk about that a bit more in the discussion. Nor will I talk very much about the economics of trade, since we have one of the world's leading experts talking about that in the afternoon, Bernard over there. So I will cover briefly 3 things. First of all, what were economists saying about the impact of Brexit before the referendum and how that impacted public perception. Second, what's happened since and how, again, that has fed into public perception. And third, what happens next, and a bit of speculation, again, as to how that will interact with the political debate. So, before the referendum, economists essentially made 2 types of forecasts. First of all, there was a set of forecasts and analysis from, I think, a very wide spectrum of the economics profession, stating, partly on the basis of models, partly on the basis of gut instinct and a mixture of things in between, that Brexit would have fairly negative consequences for the UK economy in the medium to longer term. That is, that Brexit, depending on which type of Brexit or which scenario was adopted for future trade relations, that would likely depress UK productivity growth and hence GDP per capita over the medium to long term by anywhere between 3 and 8%. So there are a set of predictions about the long-term impact of Brexit, and as I said, that had a fairly broad consensus among the economics profession, with only a few outliers. Second of all, there were a much smaller number of short-term forecasts of the immediate impact of Brexit. Including one produced by NISA, my own research institute, although not by me personally, but also by the Treasury and by the IMF. But these, I think, important to recognise that only a small number of economists and small number of institutions have the capacity to do short-term forecasting. And these predictions were essentially that Brexit would lead to significant would lead to a significant hit on growth and output in the short term. Why would this happen? This essentially would happen because of a rise in uncertainty and the concomitant fall in consumer and business confidence. Alongside of that, there was a prediction that there would be a sharp fall in sterling. Now, how did that actually impact on the public debate? Well, of course, I've given a very, very short version, but even that level of sophistication was very much not presented in the public debate. What the public got the impression was, because it was refracted through the presentation of the Remain campaign, was that the in particular for what Cameron and Osborne said, was that Brexit would mean recession, essentially. Brexit would make, Osborne, the front page of the Treasury website actually had in big red letters, or actually it said, Brexit will lead to recession in big red letters. Something I have to say I've never seen before on a Treasury website, anything like it before. And Osborne, of course, talked about the £4,300 worse off that each household would be, which was a figure based on taking one particular point estimate of the impact relative to the counterfactual on GDP in 15 years or so. So the message that the public got was very much that the Remain view was Brexit would lead to if not immediate apocalypse, would lead to a very short-term, a large and immediate economic downturn. What has actually happened? Well, one element of the short-term predictions didn't materialize. That's the fall in the pound. That's gone actually is remarkably close to the sorts of numbers that Nisa and others predicted. However, the other elements, and in particular the impact of uncertainty on consumer and business confidence, that was actually visible in the weeks following the referendum. But when people realised that the roof it didn't fall in. In fact, that quickly rebounded. So I think it's important to emphasise it was only a minority of economists who were in that game of forecasting the short term, but those who were mostly got it wrong. There are one or two honourable exceptions. I'll particularly note Paul Krugman, who said essentially, Brexit will be bad for the UK, and I'd like to believe that there will be this short-term impact, but actually I don't buy it. And Paul and a couple of others said actually these impacts will not be felt in the short term, and so far they've broadly been right. What about the medium to long-term projections of the impact of growth? Well, the very important thing to emphasise here is that we have learned absolutely nothing about what's happened since the referendum has told us very little indeed that speaks to the question of whether the medium to long-term forecasts made by the IMF, Treasury, OECD, and so on of the negative impacts on growth will in fact materialize. Those models, Bernard may say more about this, those models are unlike the short-term macro forecasting models, which tend to be rather unreliable and did in fact rely very heavily on trying to quantify the impact of uncertainty in itself, inherently a very uncertain thing to do. The medium to long-term models are much more firmly based on the empirical evidence of how trade and productivity growth are related over the medium to long term. Doesn't mean those models will be right, but it does mean that first of all, the fact that the short-term models were wrong doesn't tell us very much about whether or not they'll be right. And second, we still, I think, can have a considerably greater degree of confidence in those long-term impacts than we ever in the short term. Now, that's quite a going to the public perceptions point again, that is actually quite a difficult thing to get across. And it's quite difficult, I'm afraid, for economists to turn around and say, well, okay, admittedly, we were wrong about what would happen in the week or month or 3 months after Brexit, but you still should believe us about what's going to happen in the 15 or 20 years after Brexit. That is an analytically sensible thing to say, but it's a very, very hard thing for us to explain. My best stab at it is to say it is a bit like climate change, in the sense that We believe that climate change increases the chance of severe weather events. So we could say, the fact that we're pumping a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere makes it significantly more likely that a hurricane will hit Miami next year. But our chances of predicting correctly whether or not a hurricane hits Miami next year are still rubbish. By contrast, we can say with some degree of confidence that the fact that we're pumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere makes it likely that in 15 to 20 years the planet will, as a consequence, be 0.2 to 0.3 degrees warmer than it otherwise would have been. Now again, that could still be wrong, it's still model dependent, but it is a much more soundly based, analytically, and hence reliable model. But that is the current challenge that we economist experts find as we try to get back into the game, as it were, in terms of influencing the public debate. So what happens next? Well, we are still in the short run, and we will be in the short run for at least 6 to 12 months before any of these sort of medium to longer term effects sort of come through. However, and hence everything that I say about what's going to happen in the short run should be taken with the same grain of salt as applied to the short run forecast that came out before the referendum. However, I do think it is quite likely that the economy will begin to slow more significantly over the next 3 to 9 months. That is what most of the forecasters are predicting. It does a logical consequence of the fall in the exchange rate will be a significant rise in inflation in the UK. That is pretty much baked in. That historically is likely to be related to some fall in real consumer spending and some fall in real wages. And that will, even if GDP growth overall holds up because we see a greater, a boost to exports and a fall in imports, that will still make people feel significantly poorer because real consumer spending will be hit. Moreover, and back to my special subject, which for once I'm not presenting on today, immigration and labour mobility, I think one thing that is less appreciated than it should be is that I expect to see a very significant fall in migration over the next 3 to 9 months. Now, John referred to the civil servants who said in 2004, the Eastern Europeans won't come. I was actually chief economist at the Department for Work and Pensions, the department in charge of the UK labour market in 2004, when we took that decision. And, well, there's a long story there. I don't entirely accept the characterization. One thing I was very careful to avoid doing at the time internally was to make forecasts about what the level of migration would be, because if short-term economic forecasts are bad, forecasts of migration tend to be even worse. So I am for once actually prepared to go out on a limb. This is the first time I've done it in my entire career of now more than 15 years of the economic analysis of migration and make a short-term migration forecast. And I expect migration to the UK to fall quite significantly over the next year or so. A combination of the changing conjunctural position of the UK and EU economies on top of the fall in the exchange rate, which makes the UK considerably less attractive when you look at UK wages measured in European currencies. And on top of that, the legal and psychological impact of Brexit, even before Brexit happens, on how people feel about coming to the UK, how welcome they feel, how secure they feel in making the commitment that coming to the UK entails. So supposing that I'm right and the economy starts to slacken off and we see a significant fall in migration, what does that do to public perceptions? Well, that's I'm not going to make a forecast on because that is well outside of my comfort zone. But I do think it does change the dynamic, and this goes back perhaps to my comment in the first session. These things are very much endogenous, and I would, the environment for what the UK's negotiating position is, what the political environment is within which that negotiation takes place, seems to me very different if instead of having a reasonably comfortable level of growth, a buoyant labour market, and very high and stable or even rising inward migration, if instead the dynamic is a softening labour market, squeeze real wages, and quite sharply falling migration from the EU. Does that change the dynamic within which the UK decides what its negotiating position is and what its priorities are? I will just leave that as a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this. I think the presentation for me is very interesting for the economic capital of Brexit, but also how economic knowledge is constructed. I think we could leave that aside for this debate, but I think listening to you, I'm certainly fascinated by that. Maybe before I open the floor, I just abused the position of the chair to speak 1 minute on the Commission. It comes back to Simon's chart on how the organization and all the bubbles you showed. So I'll just take 1 minute very, very briefly, but as you know, President Juncker has appointed Michel Barnier as the chief negotiator for the conduct and the preparations of the negotiations with the UK. We are a rather small team. We are, for the moment, 25 people, and we probably will stay at that level for the foreseeable future, because one characteristic of how we intend to work is to network with the technical DGs, financial services, certainly one of them, and a number of others as well. And so I rely on the expertise of the departments for that. There is Michel Barnier is French, as the media has duly noted. He has a deputy chief negotiator who's German, Sabine Wyatt, who's a very senior civil servant, former head of cabinet of Louis Michel, deputy director general in DG Trade. And then we have people like me and others who are seconded heads of unit, in my case from DG Financial Services to Barnier's team, so to say. To remind ourselves, I'm sure you know, but we don't negotiate until Article 50 has been triggered, so we're in a bit of a peculiar situation right now, and it's kind of a scoping exercise. And what Michel Barnier is doing now is a tour of the 27 capitals, basically, to meet mostly the prime ministers or the government officials and the senior ministers who will be in charge of this, to prepare the ground also for the work of the European Council, which of course happens on the other side of Rue de la Loi. But I think we will see a very close cooperation between all the EU institutions throughout this process. And for those of you who are on Twitter, which was referred to earlier, you will see that he often tweets then and often emphasizes one key theme, which is the unity of the 27, which is a very important theme for the Commission, for him, for the member states as well, in terms of where we are now, waiting for Article 50 to be triggered. So that complements a bit of the short overview of also how Simon explained how the UK government will work on how the EU Commission, or how the Commission and the EU institutions intend to work, even though a lot of this will be unfolding over the next months in terms of European Council discussions, no doubt. So with that, I suggest we come back to the presentations and see what questions there are on the three speakers.